And the reason for that is because when you play this back on our YouTube channel, it washes out that camera. That camera is really sensitive to the white light. So you ever shined a light in somebody's eyes? You know, it's that kind of a thing. What was happening was with a complete white background here and that thing looking, it would make me stand in the dark, even though it's not dark in here. I was completely in the dark in this thing, and then when it was flipped to a darker slide, all of a sudden you could see me. And not that I wanted to be seen, but it was just changing. And so they said, do a little bit darker background, so I've gone to light blue. So hopefully it's camera friendly. We'll see about that in a little bit. Last week, I got a little bit hurry at the end, so I want to give you a part two, the germs and disease. And this week, a lot of my information came right from this periodical called Reason and Revelation. It's produced by Apologetics Press, which is the same folks who are, Kyle Butt and all them. Right now, they're up in Sevierville doing house to heart, polishing the pulpit. They're doing a whole seminar series at this moment in Sevierville. So anyway, they're wonderful folks, and this time I actually used this, so you'll see more of my slides versus the others. Okay. Why is this going to be, again, scriptures? This is just where this came from. The slides that they created from the scriptures are from the New King James Version, and the other scriptures I have are from the Strong's Concordance, which is King James. And then this is the video series. It's the World VBS, which is also done by Apologetics Press. And this is the guy who I borrowed this from, Kyle Butt. And he's still with them. Even though some of this material like this article here that I found was written in 2006. So, but I think Apologetics Press has been here, I don't know when I think it's back in the 80s, maybe earlier. So there's Kyle, and there's the Holy Bible, and this is what we're here about. And the reason for these lessons is to get, and I'm going to keep repeating this so that way it gets into your mind. The reason for these lessons is so that you can introduce these subjects to people who may not be churched. And by introducing these subjects and showing that there is an explanation for things in science that only God has the answer for, it may lead to them being more open to going to church, because there's a whole 4 decades of generations who stopped going to church. Back in the 70s, when I became a Christian at the end of 79, but in the 70s there was a big explosion. I think the Churches of Christ were the fastest growing denomination in the country. But it ebbs and flows, and so what happened is, since then, church attendance, and again this is across Christendom, has gone down because people have decided that they can just be good moral people. And one of the interesting comments I heard from a guy named Dennis Prager. Have any of y'all know who that is, Dennis Prager? He's a gray-headed gentleman. He's a Jew, and he goes around and does tours with a guy named Adam Carolla, who used to have a popular show called Man's Something. But the two of them are kind of opposites. He's an older, 70-something 80-year-old Jewish man, and Adam Carolla is this, 40, 50-year-old guy, probably 30 years his junior, who's kind of a macho, beer-drinking kind of, and so they have a really interesting dynamic, but they both kind of converge on the ideas of culture, what's happening to culture, and how we're getting away from God. And Dennis Prager wrote a book about, I think it's called the cut flower principle, and basically what that means is we had religion and people were churched, and people raised their families in the church in the 50s and 60s, and you see all those quaint Norman Rockwell pictures about that. But what he described is what happened is you cut the flower, and then we all know flowers are beautiful. We'll cut flowers and we'll give them to our loved ones, and we'll put them in a vase, and we'll take them inside the house. But after a period of time, what happens? The flower loses its beauty and eventually dies. And that's what he attributes to what's happened in our culture. Even though we were good moral people, we cut ourselves off from the root, which is Jesus and his word, and being around other Christians. And even though we were good moral people, we end up losing our root system, and once you cut a root off, the plant ends up dying. So I think he wrote a whole book about this principle. I think it's called the cut flower principle. And so that's the reason why we're doing these lessons, is try to get people back into church and showing them that God is not necessarily a bad thing. And all these little people here are all the people that we've saved lives. And that's actually, it's in reference to what Moses did and taking his people through the land on his way to the promised land. And what we're going to look at with Moses' writings in the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, that he had scientific knowledge that was not necessarily known at the time that it was scientific, but it was just recorded in Scripture because God commanded Moses to do it this way. But now we see the relevance and see the scientific value of what those things are. So this is going to be part 2 on the germs thing. We stopped right at the end of where I started talking about hand washing and stuff. So just to remind you, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, has rules about food safety. And what I wanted to talk about for a moment is this idea of Fat Tom. I told you last week I went to culinary school. And when I went to culinary school, we had to make sure that we went through a class called ServSafe. And so every restaurateur who is part of the National Restaurant Association has to have ServSafe certificated employees who handle food. And ServSafe was this, basically it's just all the rules about how to produce the food, what temperature, how you store it, how you move it, how you touch it, how you prepare it, how you keep it, all through the process, and how to prevent people from getting sick. And so what a acronym that they gave us to remember this is that big scary thing that I showed you at the end of last week was that one bacteria can double, you got 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and a bacteria double, every 10 minutes. So you can have one single bacteria, and I thought this was interesting. I opened up my laptop today, and it's a black screen when it goes dead, right? Have you ever looked at your black screen on your computer and seen all these little specks? You know what I'm talking about? What is that? That's stuff that's come, it's been in the air, or it's because I've been talking, or Sandy's been yelling at me and something's coming. But there's all these spots on that computer screen. Well, when the computer's on and the light's coming through it, you don't see any of that. But when it's just a black screen, you see all these dots and all these germs on there. And so think about this. That one bacteria in 10 hours can be 1 billion. So that's why this food processing and why this is so important. And I'm going to tell you what the Fat Tom stands for. And this all comes from Food Safety Training School. It's also on YouTube. But these are what the 6 words mean: food, acidity, time, temperature, oxygen, and moisture. So what foods are we particularly looking at that are important? Why is food it's because bacteria eat it, basically. So that's what the bacteria look for. They're looking for some nutrient source. And there's these things called TCS foods, time, temperature control for safety foods. And there's a danger zone when it involves them. So TCS foods, this is the slide that I just got a chance to show you what these were. And I was going through them. And if you notice, it says eggs, fish and shellfish, baked potatoes, rice, bean sprouts, untreated garlic oil mixtures, dairy products, meat and poultry. And there's 2 others that aren't listed here. One's tofu, and the other one is cut and sliced vegetables. Now, each one of these has a reason why it falls in this TCS, time, temperature control for safety foods, is because how many of you realize that eggs, when they come out of the chicken, you can store those at room temperature for 2 weeks? Right from the farm. You can take an egg, and people say, oh, that's so dirty. You know where it comes from? But there's something on that eggshell. It's called bloom. And that bloom that's on eggshell protects the eggshell so much the case that bacteria can't get through it. Because eggshells are porous. And what happens when you wash an egg, and in the United States, by the way, all grocery eggs that have been washed have to be refrigerated. So that's why you go to the refrigerated section here in the United States to get your eggs. But over in Europe and other places, eggs go right straight from the farm to the farmer's market and you can pick up eggs and keep them 2 weeks or up to 4 weeks in your house with no problem. And you can test the egg whether or not it's still good to eat by simply dropping it in water. And if it sinks to the bottom, lays flat, it's still good. But if it floats up to the top, that means air has gotten inside and gone through the pores, and there's an air pocket, and that's what's causing that egg to float. So God designed the chicken to lay an egg that is impervious to bacteria at room temperature. But because we decided to wash those eggs, and put them in the refrigerator, now we have to use them, keep them refrigerated, and as soon as you have them out at room temperature in 2 hours, you need to use them. So that's why eggs are there. The other thing, the fish and shellfish we talked about last week because of all the poisons and the scariest thing about the shellfish one was you can't smell when shellfish is bad. And the other thing is you can't cook out the bacteria. So if you get bad shellfish, whether you cook it or not doesn't change. And so the only recourse you have is to make sure you're buying shellfish from a reputable source. So that's the scariest thing about shellfish, because shellfish is probably the most toxic thing of all this stuff, is because there's certain types, if they come from a contaminated source, they can actually 1 in 2 people who contract it die from it. So that's one of the reasons I kind of avoid oysters on the half shell, but I do like them. Baked potatoes, and the reason why they're in that category is because they're moist, hot, and they're in this temperature danger zone, which I'll show you about it. Then you got rice, so anytime you cook the vegetable, there's a temperature danger zone for that. So the rice, beans, bean sprouts are on the list, and the reason they're there is because they're served raw most of the time. And so there were some concerns, you remember about people getting scallions, where the scallions were raw and they weren't cleaned properly. So that's why bean sprouts are in this category. Untreated garlic oil mixtures, you've probably seen all those fancy bottles with all the stuff in it and all the decorative. Don't ever use that oil in there because most likely it will have botulism in it, even though there's no air present. Then the other thing is dairy products and then meat and poultry. So we all know those things. And so so the second category is acidity. Bacteria likes to grow in areas between 4.6 and neutral. And so the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. 14 is alkaline, 0 is totally acidic, and then 7 is right in the middle. And where the bacteria like to grow is from 4.6 to 7.0. And guess what? All those foods in that TCS category are right in that acidic level. When things get really acidic, guess what? That's what pickling does, why pickling preserves stuff. That's why wine can be preserved. That's why vinegars are preserved, because it has so much high acidity. The acidity is below 4.6, but I won't go into all the different topics. The other thing was time. Bacteria is doubling. So if it's in the right conditions, it's going to double and double. And so every minute that you have stuff out at certain temperatures, then the bacteria grow best from the temperature of 40 degrees to 140. What's significant about 40? Where do you keep your refrigerator? What temperature is it at? 37. Mine's at 39, but they say you need to keep your refrigerator below 41 degrees, and this is the reason why. Cold temperatures don't stop the growth of bacteria, it just slows it. Freezing does stop the growth, but doesn't kill it. So bacteria is there. It's always there. So because it's everywhere, like I was telling you with my computer screen, it's there, it's happening. Animals and plants create bacteria, or it's just there and we house it, so to speak. But there's another zone. Here's the temperature danger zone, so 40 to 140. And then what you want to do is you want to keep it out of the danger zone, but we live in the danger zone, don't we? And in fact, which I call the picnic area, the zone where it grows the most is from 70 degrees to 120. Which is where we live all the time, right? Our houses are at 70 degrees, and we go up to 90, and 90 is awful for us, right? So 70 to 90, so right between where we like to live, 70 to 90 degrees, where humans thrive, and that's where food bacteria grows the fastest. And most bacteria require oxygen to grow, and that's why you seal bags. That's why when you can stuff, you take the oxygen out. That's why when you cover stuff with cellophane. And then the last thing, now, there are some bacteria that don't take oxygen, which is botulism. So anytime you get a dented can be careful, because that dent could have introduced bacteria and botulism could have occurred. And the last thing is moisture. Standing water ends up stinking, right? Everybody's been in an open sewer or open lake or water that's been standing. That's bacteria growth. And we all know, our bodies, we've got areas that are moist and have hair and our feet. That smell is bacteria growth. That's what that is. And so moisture, you want to eliminate moisture, and that's why people do food savers, right? They vacuum all that air out to get out the moisture and also remove the oxygen. So the best thing you can do with all the stuff that I learned is prevent cross-contamination, which means basically wash your hands. If you notice, it says hand washing. Thoroughly wash your hands with soap and water and at least 20 seconds, and that water should be 100 degrees. And after handling food, and then using the restroom or touching potentially contaminated surfaces. And they also talk about using gloves or clothing accessories, but basically personal hygiene is the number one thing, and there's a reason for that. And this is going to be gross, but you need to know why. This is what scared me in culinary school. They said they use this term fecal-oral route or fecal-oral transmission. And you're going to see why this is important, because I want you to remember this, all these warnings it says here. It says fecal-oral transmission is a key route to disease and spread of contaminated food or water. Pathogens found in feces can infect others when ingested, often due to poor hygiene, washing hands. And then it says inadequate hand washing after toilet use or diaper changes can transfer pathogens to food or mouths. And then contaminated water sources, especially in areas with poor sanitation, pose a high risk for disease spread. In India, half the population doesn't have running water. Open sewers, open contamination. And the other interesting thing about the hand washing after, there's a group that went out and interviewed people on the streets and said, how many folds to toilet paper should you use when you're doing number 2? And they said, 1, 2, 3. Well, it was actually a trick question, because the stuff can go through the toilet paper up to 10 folds, and nobody does 10 folds. And so it's basically the answer to the question was, you can't. The real answer is wash your hands afterwards. That's the only thing that's going to prevent this fecal oil route, is washing your hands. And then they have this F diagram, which means there's 5 F's on things, so fingers, flies, fluids, fields, and food. Fingers, wash your hands. Flies, flies fly from one thing to the next thing. About fields, basically, anybody who's on a septic system knows if you see standing water in your yard where your septic system is, you've got something coming up. And then sometimes you find playgrounds that are built over these things. Do you want your kids playing in that? Well, the reason no is because this is what's happening. Fluids, drinking or cooking with contaminated water can lead to infections. And again, that's when we have flooding and stuff, you have to boil your water. And then food, improperly handled or cooked food can be a source of pathogens, which we've seen. And the last thing about this is diseases spread via this route, including cholera, typhoid fever, hepatitis A. Almost all these major epidemics that we've had through history have been due to poor sanitation, to open sewers, people dumping their excrement and urine in the streets, and it's always in cities where people are combined together. Symptoms of disease range from mild to severe stuff. Preventive measures include frequent hand washing and safe food handling and proper sanitation practices. Community education on hygiene and sanitation can significantly reduce transmission risks. Guess who did that? Moses. Moses wrote prescriptions on exactly that last thing. Community education on hygiene and sanitation can significantly reduce transmissions. This is modern, but Moses did that 3,500 years ago. So in Exodus 2 in verse 10, it says, and this is talking about Moses and his childhood. It says, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses. And she said, because I draw him out of the water. Now in Acts chapter 7, 20-23, when Stephen's given his testimony to the Jews, and he recounts all the history of the Israelites, he says, in which time Moses was born and was exceedingly fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So what's significant about this is that Moses, remember, Egypt is the leading nation of the entire world. You've got all the pyramids there. You had the Library of Alexandria. Everybody, Egypt was that first country. And so all the wizards, all the sorcerers, all the medicine people, everything was done in Egypt. So Moses learned it all. And this is what I'm trying to share with you, that Moses knew every bit of Egyptian culture because he was raised as one of Pharaoh's sons. So why is that important? So when he writes the Old Testament in the first 5 books, this is ancient discovery. In 1872, and they discovered this in Egypt by a guy named Josh Ebers. And that actually means George. The reason I say Josh is because I had an uncle. Uncle Josh is actually Uncle George. And since this was a German guy who found this out, so I'm just going to do him some honor and call him Josh. So Josh Ebers found this papyrus, which was a medical papyrus. And a papyrus is just a document, and in it, it had 811 remedies and concoctions and medicine practices that the Egyptians were doing, 811 of them. And I'm just pulled 4 of them out here. Removal of splinters. What do you need to do to get that? Well, you need to make a poultice of worm blood, mole, and donkey dung. If you want to cure skin disease, you need to take a hog's tooth, you know what hogs eat, and use cat and dog dung to cure skin disease. And they had other remedies where they used dried child excrement, they used hog dung and farmer's urine. And then if you want to prevent hair growth, because remember all the Egyptians, whenever you see the movies, they're always bald. So Don, you're an Egyptian. So to prevent hair growth, this is what you would have had to do to make sure you got that nice clean look. He says you should use lizard dung, blood of a cow, donkey, pig, dog, and stag. So think about this. This is what's in these writings. These are medical writings that the ancient philosophers, ancient people, ancient medicine people, that the entire world, the Greeks went to them, the Persians went to them, the Indians went to them. All the empires went to Egypt to get their knowledge and go study there. So what happened is, so do you see a common denominator in these? I think I have them in red. Dung, right? Now, what did we learn from the fecal oral root? Bad. Supremely bad. And you know what? Even in this papyrus, it said that they came up with this philosophy that it's a good and laudable thing to have pus. And what the ancient, and I say the ancient Chinese secret, but that was from an old commercial back in the 70s. I think it was a dry cleaner, I'm not sure. But you know, all the Chinese dry cleaners came up, and I think there's an ancient Chinese secret. So that's how they clean clothes. But this is actually the ancient Egyptian secret. They believed that pus was a good thing. And the doctors would take and they would infect people to get them to pus up. And so they would go to their wounds and make sure they'd stab them. And they end up killing millions of people doing this because they infected them, because they created pus. And they also treated sore eyes with, for some of you who are asleep, they treated sore eyes with the urine of a faithful wife. Oh, and they had various helpful remedies. They also had lots of things that were good too, like they had some drugs like opium and for pain killing, and they had some helpful remedies. But the bad thing was it was overshadowed because you couldn't really trust it, because they used ingredients like blood, excrement, and urine in their medical practices. So it was overshadowed by a really bad thing. When Moses wrote this, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, he didn't write this as a medical prescription. He didn't write it as a medical textbook. He simply wrote those rules of the road. They were going to go out on the road, and he wrote things about sanitation, which we're going to talk about. He wrote things about quarantine, and then other medical procedures, which would include circumcision. And the interesting thing about this, the Egyptian remedies were remarkably absent in Moses' writing. Remember, Moses spent 40 years being instructed on everything that the Egyptians knew in the Pharaoh's house. So here he knows all the knowledge of Egypt, But he does not mention any one of these weird things, does he? None of them. They're remarkably absent. And you think if he wrote based off of what their knowledge was, they would be there because he wouldn't have known any better. But he did know better because he had scientific foreknowledge, even though he didn't know that term. So under sanitation, in Leviticus chapter 15, they talk about issues. Now there's different types of issues. There's normal issues and there's issues that are bad from like wounds and stuff. But pus would be considered one of those issues. Look what happens in Leviticus 15 when they talk about pus from wounds. It says, which is in contrast exactly to the Egyptian practice where they were trying to create it. Body fluids from infection where there's not normal function, and then also the normal male seed and the menses where there are specific restrictions for those. But if any issue happened, you were considered unclean. Not only you personally as a person, but your clothing and the contact surfaces. Remember cross-contamination? The TCS foods, it's all about hand washing. So you had to wash in running water, you had to wash your clothes, and you had any vessels that were earthen vessels, in other words, they had pores, they had to be broken and destroyed. If they were wooden, or if they were made out of material like linen or cotton, those could be washed. But what's interesting about wood, which we'll find out in a moment, is wood is antibacterial by nature. Then in Deuteronomy chapter 23, it says, "Thou shalt have a place also without the camp, whether thou shalt go forth abroad, and thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon. And it shall be, when thou shalt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee." What is that all saying? Basically, where do you do number 2? And it says you need a designated place, it needs to be outside the camp, and it needs to be buried. And isn't that a contrast to all the Egyptian remedies? Moses was instructed by God not to use excrement. In fact, he said, bury it. Get it out from among your people. But the Egyptians were using it in all their medicinal practices. It's kind of scary, isn't it? I would not want to go to the doctor as an Egyptian. I could walk like an Egyptian, but that's a song for those who are a little older. Remember that? All right, so scientific foreknowledge. Again, this is going to be the next section is quarantine and leprosy. We all know what leprosy is. Leviticus chapter 13 talks about it. It says, "Then the priest shall look upon it, and behold, if the rising of the sore be white, reddish in his bald head, or in his bald forehead, as leprosy appears in the skin of the flesh, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him utterly unclean, and his plague is in his head. And the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent, and his head bare, and he shall put a covering upon his upper lip, and shall cry, Unclean, unclean. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him shall be defiled. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone without the camp, and without the camp shall be his habitation." Leprosy, what do we learn? Disease is a contagion. It spreads through contact. You cover your mouth, which we all do that, and we teach our children. Don't cough on anybody. Don't spit on people. In fact, if you spit on a police officer, it's assault. Just ask some of these ICE agents who are getting in trouble. They're in, and then isolation outside the camp from healthy. So basically, all these prescriptions we do use today. So quarantine, concepts of modern sanitation. In the book called The Sketch of Medicine and Pharmacy, it noticed 2 concepts. One of cleanliness that's found, and the other one is isolation and quarantine. Those are the 2 methods for modern sanitation. But in Understanding Contagion by the Encyclopedia of Medical History, which was written, it says that classical medical tradition, this was non-existent. Back in the Hippocratic, you've heard of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm? That Hippocrates lived like 450 BC-ish, and the Hippocratic writings that they're talking about were written between 400 BC and 100 AD, so for like a 500-year period. Nowhere in any of those writings does it talk about dealing with sanitation with what Moses talked about being clean, isolate, and quarantine. The Old Testament is accurate medical knowledge because it dealt with leprosy and venereal disease. So here's that book. There's a cover of it. See, the idea of a contagion was foreign to the classic medical tradition and found no place in the voluminous Hippocratic writings. And again, all these writings were all found in Alexandria, Egypt, in the libraries, where all this papyrus was found from Ebers, from Josh Ebers, which shows that there's scientific foreknowledge. Now, this is the one I found that was very interesting. It says circumcision is going to happen the 8th day. This was given to Abraham, and it says in verse 12 of chapter 17 of Genesis, it says, "He that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generation, he that is born in the house, or bought with money, or of a stranger, which is not of thy seed." Well, we know that circumcision is a surgical practice, and so there's a concern for hemorrhaging, which just means bleeding. So medical outcomes from this is, according to a pediatrician, it prevents disease and prevents infection. And here are the numbers. What's interesting here is that urinary tract infections for newborns who are uncircumcised have a 10 to 20 time chance, 10 instance of having urinary tract infections for those who are uncircumcised newborns. STDs are more readily passed in uncircumcised men in adulthood. And if a child is circumcised, the chances of him getting penile cancer is almost zero. So it only happens in uncircumcised adults. So the evolution, and all these findings here were done on an evolutionary basis. They were done by scientists who didn't believe in God. They weren't trying to prove God to be true or prove Moses to be true. This was just from their evidence of pediatrics and what was going on. So there's a study that happened. It was done over a long time. It was done from 1896 to 1953. This guy Holt wrote this book called Holt Pediatrics, and it's a 1,500-page work, and it was kept getting revised and revised and revised. So it had, I don't know how many revisions, but 1,500 pages must be a lot of work. Well, there's a chapter on hemorrhagic disease of the newborn, which is talking about a child possibly having this happen. And this can happen during a circumcision. So there's severe damage. What this causes is severe damage to major organs in your system, and if it happens to the brain, it can lead to death. And why is this happening? Because there's a decreased levels of prothrombin and vitamin K. And these two things are essential in factors of blood clotting cascade. So talk to a nurse, because they'll probably tell you more about this, but basically your blood leads to clot, and these two things help that process happen. So do you think Abraham, when he took those kids and circumcised them all on the 8th day, that he got one on the first day, and then he took one on the second day, and then he said, took one on the third day, and took one on the fourth day, took one on the fifth, sixth day, a little better, seventh day? No, he didn't practice. He didn't. This was not done by trial and error. He was told a specific day. And this is what's fascinating. The levels of this prothrombin that's needed for the blood clotting, on day one of the baby's, once a baby's born, it's at 90% level. And then it drops off precipitously, and it drops to 35% on day 3. But on day 8, it's at 110%, which is the peak. And in fact, that's higher, it's 20% higher than the first day, and it's 10% higher than the rest of the life of that child. So on the 8th day, you have the best chance of not happening. And then what Holt recognized, again, this is not a guy written, wasn't a Christian. This is from his 1,500-page study over 60 years. He said there was a peculiar increase in hemorrhagic disease between day 2 and 5. Isn't that fascinating that God knew that the 8th day was the best day to do this, and Abraham had no idea. He just followed what God said. But circumcision, so statutes and judgments, what do we learn from this? Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as my Lord God commanded me, that you should do them in the land whither you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation. It is wise and understanding people. So when Moses wrote this, and when Abraham did the practice, you notice it was God commanded. It wasn't trial and error by Moses or his people, but that's what the skeptics want you to believe. And it was the reason why it was done is before wisdom and understanding, and then also that the other nations would recognize God.